Imagine for a moment that you woke up in the year 1870, in the middle of the Arizona desert, with no cell phone, no GPS, no supermarket around the corner, just you, the blazing sun, and a land where the nearest law might be hundreds of miles away. How long would you survive? 3 days? A week? The truth is that in the American Old West, between 1850 and 1890, survival wasn't a matter of luck, but of brutal knowledge of the unwritten rules that separated the living from the dead. Today you'll discover these rules that few know, secrets that kept men and women alive during one of the most dangerous periods in American history. Before we begin this journey into America's wildest past, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any fascinating historical content like this. And tell me in the comments, what time are you watching this video? I'm curious to know when you most consume this type of content. The first rule of survival in the Old West was simple and brutal. Never trust appearances alone. In 1876, a trader named Samuel Morton learned this the hard way. He was traveling the Santa Fe Trail when he encountered a well-dressed man with clean clothes and a friendly smile, asking for a ride. Morton, being a kind-hearted man, offered him a seat in his wagon. 3 hours later, he woke up tied to a tree, with no money, no horses, and a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. The well-dressed man was actually Gentleman Jim, one of the most wanted outlaws in the territory. The lesson here wasn't to become paranoid, but to develop a sixth sense for detecting inconsistencies. Clothes to clean in dusty territory, hands to soft for a working man, or eyes that never stopped scanning for escape routes, were signs that experienced men learned to spot instantly. The second rule was even more fundamental. Water is worth more than gold, literally. There are documented records of prospectors trading gold nuggets for canteens of water during the extreme droughts of 1863 in Nevada. But the issue wasn't just finding water, it was knowing where to look and how to purify it. The Native Americans, whom the settlers so feared, actually possessed life-saving knowledge. They knew that following ants in single file would eventually lead to a water source. They knew that digging at the lowest point of a dry riverbed, usually 2 or 3 feet deep, would find water naturally filtered through the sand. And most importantly, they knew that boiling water with stones heated over a fire eliminated diseases that killed more settlers than gunfire. The third rule was timing. In the Old West, time wasn't just money, it was life. Traveling during the hottest hours of the day was practically suicide. True survivors learned from the desert animals. Wake before dawn, travel until 10 in the morning, rest in the shade during the peak heat, and resume the journey after 4 in the afternoon. This rule saved thousands of lives, but broke countless others. The pressure to reach the gold fields quickly or to escape pursuers led many to ignore this basic rule. The result was bodies found days later, dehydrated under the relentless desert sun. The fourth rule was about food, and here things got really interesting. Forget the juicy steaks of Western movies. The real diet of Old West survivors was based on 3 pillars: beans, bacon, and coffee. But not by chance. Beans provided durable protein that didn't spoil easily. Bacon, in addition to protein, provided the essential fat the body needed to function in extreme conditions. And coffee wasn't a luxury, it was fuel. Caffeine kept men alert during nighttime watches, when attacks by wild animals or bandits were most likely. But true survivalists went beyond this basic triad. They learned from the natives how to identify edible plants. The yucca, for example, not only provided water in its roots, but its flowers were nutritious. Pine nuts were a rich source of protein and fat, and in extreme cases, they knew that lizards and snakes, when prepared correctly, could be the difference between life and death. The fifth rule was about shelter, and here creativity became a matter of survival. In the Old West, you didn't have the option of booking a hotel. You had to create your own refuge, and you had to do it well, because a poorly protected night could be your last. Survivors learned that the ideal shelter had 3 characteristics: protection from the wind, enough elevation to avoid flash floods, and proximity to water, but not so close that it became a target for wild animals coming to drink. The most effective technique was what they called a 3-wall shelter. You found a rock formation that offered natural protection on 3 sides and built a wall on the 4th side using stones and branches. This created a microclimate that could be up to 15 degrees warmer than the outside during cold desert nights. The 6th rule was about guns, but not in the way you might think. Yes, having a gun was important, but knowing when not to use it was even more crucial. An unnecessary shot could be heard miles away, alerting both dangerous animals and people with malicious intent. To your location, true survivors developed a silent arsenal. Knives were preferable to pistols for hunting small game. Traps were more effective than bullets for capturing food regularly. And in many cases, the best weapon was the ability to become invisible, to slip unnoticed through dangerous territory without leaving a trace. The 7th rule concerned navigation, a skill that separated adventurers from professional survivalists. In the Old West, getting lost meant almost certain death, but maps were rare, inaccurate, and often deliberately incorrect to confuse competitors in search of gold. Survivors learned to read the language of the land. They knew that moss grows predominantly on the north side of trees and rocks. They knew that certain constellations, such as the Big Dipper, were reliable natural compasses. But most importantly, they developed the habit of creating their own landmarks. With every mile they traveled, they stacked rocks in distinctive formations, creating a rocky breadcrumb trail that could save them if they needed to return the same way. The 8th rule concerned emergency medicine, because in the Wild West, there was no emergency room on the corner. An infected cut, a snake bite, or a simple fracture could be a death sentence if you didn't know what to do. Survivors carried a basic medical kit with them, but more importantly, they knew how to use natural resources. Wild honey was a powerful, natural antibiotic. Willow bark, when boiled, created a tea that relieved pain and fever. It was literally natural aspirin. And in cases of snake bite, they knew that cutting the area and sucking out the venom was a dangerous myth. The correct approach was to immobilize the affected limb, keep the victim calm, and seek medical help as quickly as possible, even if it meant days of travel. The 9th rule concerned the psychology of survival, an aspect few consider, but which was absolutely crucial. The Wild West didn't just test your body, it tested your mind. The extreme isolation, the constant threat of danger, and the uncertainty about the future created a psychological pressure that broke many men. Before any physical threat even reached them, survivors developed mental techniques to cope. They maintained rigid routines, even in chaotic situations, because routine created a sense of normalcy and control. They talked to themselves, not out of madness, but as a way to process information and keep their minds active. And most importantly, they always had a clear goal, a reason to keep fighting, whether it was reuniting with family, finding gold, or simply proving to themselves that they could survive. The 10th rule was about energy conservation, a concept that went far beyond simply resting when tired. In the harsh environment of the Wild West, every calorie burned had to be justified. Survivors learned that running was for extreme emergencies, steady walking was for long distances, and that stopping completely for a few minutes every hour was more efficient than walking continuously until exhaustion. They knew that carrying unnecessary weight could be fatal, so they developed a cruel hierarchy of importance: water first, food second, weapons third, and everything else could be discarded if necessary. Some veterans went so far as to weigh every item of their equipment and calculate exactly how many extra calories each item would cost to carry. The 11th rule concerned weather reading, a skill that literally separated the living from the dead. In the Old West, a sudden storm could turn a gentle stream into a deadly river in a matter of minutes. Survivors learned to read signs that foreshadowed dangerous weather changes. They knew that when birds flew low, rain was coming. They knew that a ring around the moon indicated a change in the weather within the next 24 hours. Most importantly, they knew the signs of a flash flood, the sudden silence of insects, a metallic smell in the air, and changes in the color of the water upstream. This skill saved thousands of lives, because in the desert, more people drowned in flash floods than died of thirst. The 12th rule concerned fire management, and here the difference between amateur and professional became stark. Fire in the Old West wasn't just for cooking and keeping warm. It was protection from wild animals, signaling for rescue, water purification, and in emergencies. Even medicine when used to cauterize wounds. But fire was also dangerous. A stray spark could start a blaze that would destroy thousands of acres and kill anyone in its path. Survivors developed sophisticated fire management techniques. They always built fires in natural depressions or created stone circles. They kept water or sand nearby for emergencies. Most importantly, they knew how to start a fire in adverse conditions, with wet wood, during windstorms, or using only a lens to concentrate sunlight. The 13th rule concerned animal behavior, knowledge that could save your life or spell your death. In the Old West, you shared your territory with bears, wolves, cougars, venomous snakes, and a variety of other predators that viewed you as an intruder or, in some cases, dinner. Survivors learned that each animal had predictable behavior patterns. Bears, for example, rarely attacked if you made enough noise to alert them to your presence. Attacks usually occurred when the bear was surprised. Wolves almost never attacked isolated humans, but they proved extremely dangerous in packs during harsh winters when food was scarce. Rattlesnakes always gave warning before attacking, unless accidentally stepped on, and cougars were perhaps the most dangerous because they attacked silently and always from behind. So never turning your back on an area where cougars might be hiding was a golden rule. The 14th rule was about supply management, the art of making a little go a long way. In the Wild West, you couldn't just go to the supermarket when you ran out of food. You had to carry everything you needed, and you had to make it last until you found civilization or die trying. The survivors developed sophisticated preservation techniques. They knew that meat could be preserved for weeks if cut into thin strips and dried in the sun, what the natives called jerky. They knew that salt was not just a seasoning, but an essential preservative that prevented food from spoiling. And they developed strict rationing systems. In critical situations, a handful of beans and a strip of bacon could sustain them for a whole day, leaving enough energy to keep walking, but not enough for extreme exertion. The 15th rule concerned stealth movement, the ability to move through territory undetected. In the Old West, being seen by the wrong person at the wrong time could mean certain death. Bandits, hostile tribes, and even other desperate survivors posed constant threats. Masters of survival learned to move like ghosts. They knew that traveling during sandstorms provided natural cover. They knew that following dry riverbeds eliminated traceable footprints. And they developed the ability to assess terrain from afar, identifying routes that offered maximum cover with minimum exposure. Some went so far as to travel only on nights with a new moon, when total darkness rendered them virtually invisible. The 16th rule concerned resource identification, the crucial ability to distinguish between what was useful and what was deadly waste. In the Wild West, a misidentification could be your last. Plants that looked edible could be poisonous. Water that seemed clear could be contaminated with fatal diseases. Minerals that shone like gold could be worthless pyrite. Survivors developed rigorous tests for everything. For unfamiliar plants, they followed the universal edibility test. First, they rubbed the plant on their skin to check for allergic reactions, then touched it to their lips, then their tongue, and only then, if there were no adverse reactions, consumed a small amount. For water, they observed whether animals drank from the source, checked for algae or dead insects, and always boiled it whenever possible. And for minerals, they learned simple tests. Real gold was heavy and didn't scratch easily, while pyrite was lighter and left scratches when scraped with a knife. The 17th rule was about emergency signaling, because sometimes survival meant being found by the right people. In the Old West, if you were lost or injured, your chances of survival depended on being able to communicate your location to potential rescuers. Survivors developed a sophisticated system of signals. Small mirrors could reflect sunlight for miles, creating flashes that were visible even to people who weren't specifically looking for you. Smoke during the day, especially black smoke created by burning wet or oily material, could be seen from great distances, and at night, fires in specific patterns, 3 fires in a straight line, for example, were universally recognized as distress signals. but more importantly, they knew when not to signal. In territories controlled by bandits or hostile tribes, a distress signal could attract the very people you were trying to avoid. The 18th rule concerned wound care because, in the Wild West, a minor wound could quickly become a fatal infection. Without modern antibiotics, survivors had to rely on traditional knowledge and natural resources. They knew that wild honey had powerful antibacterial properties and could prevent infection in cuts. They knew that certain plants, like aloe vera, accelerated the healing of burns. And in extreme cases, they knew that cauterization with a hot iron could save a life, stopping bleeding that would otherwise be fatal. But perhaps most importantly, they knew how to prevent injuries in the first place by keeping knives sharp. Dull knives required more force and were more likely to slip, wearing proper boots to prevent ankle sprains, and always keeping their hands clean whenever possible. The 19th rule concerned mental mapping, the ability to create and maintain a detailed mental map of the territory through which you were traveling. In the Old West, physical maps were rare, inaccurate, or non-existent. Your life depended on your ability to remember landmarks, distances, and alternate routes. Survivors developed sophisticated memorization techniques. They created historical narratives for each leg of the journey. I passed the rock that looks like a giant cactus 3 hours after leaving the water source. They used their own bodies as a measuring device. The next mountain is exactly 5,000 paces from here, and they always planned escape routes, identifying at least 2 different ways to leave any area in case of emergency. The 20th rule was about seasonal adaptation, because the Wild West was an environment that changed dramatically with the seasons, and strategies that worked in the summer could be suicidal in the winter. During the warm months, the priority was finding shade and conserving water. During the winter, especially at high altitudes, the priority shifted to staying warm and finding enough food to maintain the accelerated metabolism that the cold demanded. Survivors learned to read subtle seasonal cues. Certain plants bloomed before significant climate changes. Bird migration patterns indicated when harsh winters were coming, and even insect behavior provided clues to impending temperature changes. Most importantly, they completely adjusted their survival strategies based on the season, changing not only equipment, but also travel routes, food sources, and even activity schedules. The 21st rule concerned cache systems, the art of hiding supplies in strategic locations for future use. In the Old West, carrying everything you needed was impossible, so experienced survivalists created networks of caches throughout their regular territories. They chose locations that were distinctive enough to be easily found again, but not so obvious that other travelers would discover them. Distinctive tree bases, unique rock formations, or river intersections were ideal locations. They protected their caches from animals by using metal containers when possible, or by burying supplies in waterproof bags. Most importantly, they created backup systems. They never relied on a single cache, but always had at least 2 or 3 options in any area where they operated regularly. The 22nd rule was about energy conservation during travel, because in the Wild West, efficient movement could mean the difference between reaching your destination alive or dying along the way. Survivors learned that there was a science to walking long distances over difficult terrain. They developed a specific rhythm, usually slightly longer than natural strides, but at a slower cadence that maximized distance while minimizing fatigue. They knew that climbing mountains required a specific zigzag technique that reduced leg strain, and they developed rest regimes that involved stopping for 5 minutes every hour, removing boots and massaging feet, and checking equipment for wear and damage. These small adjustments could mean the difference between completing a 50-kilometer journey or collapsing exhausted after 20. The 23rd rule was about predator deterrence, specific strategies for avoiding confrontations with dangerous animals without using weapons. In the Wild West, you shared the habitat with predators that had evolved over millions of years to be perfect, killing machines. Fighting them directly was rarely a good idea, so smart survivors learned deterrence techniques. For bears, they carried small bells that made a constant noise, alerting animals to their presence from afar. For cougars, They knew never to crouch or bend over when a cougar was nearby, because this activated the animal's hunting instinct. For snakes, they developed a specific walking style that sent vibrations through the ground, giving snakes warning and time to escape. And for wolves, they knew that fire was the ultimate deterrent. Wolves had an instinctive fear of flames that could be exploited for protection. The 24th rule concerned water procurement in extreme conditions, because in the Wild West desert, obvious water sources were rare, and competition for them could be deadly. The survivors learned techniques for extracting water from seemingly dry environments. They knew that digging at the base of cliffs during the early morning hours often revealed water that had condensed overnight. They knew that certain cacti, when cut open carefully, contained potable water, though they also knew that some cacti water was toxic and could cause severe illness. They developed techniques for collecting dew using cloth spread out overnight, which could yield surprising amounts of water in proper conditions. And in extreme cases, they knew that urine could be distilled using solar stills made from plastic sheets and containers, recovering precious water that would otherwise be lost. The 25th rule was about shelter insulation, techniques for creating microclimates that could mean a difference of 20 degrees temperature inside versus outside. In the Wild West, nights could be brutally cold even during summer months, especially at high altitudes. Survivors learned that air was an excellent insulator when trapped properly. They created double-walled shelters using available materials, trapping air between layers. Did you know that dry grass, leaves, or sand could be stuffed between clothing layers to create insulation? And they developed techniques for warming rocks into fires and then bringing them inside shelters, creating natural heating systems that could last for hours. More importantly, they learned body heat conservation techniques, always keeping head covered, because significant heat loss occurred through the skull, and sleeping in positions that minimized body surface area exposed to cold air. The 26th rule was about food preservation without refrigeration, because in the Wild West, food spoilage wasn't just inconvenience, it was a potential death sentence. Survivors developed sophisticated methods for extending food life in hot, dry conditions. Smoking meat over low fires not only preserved it, but also created a barrier against insects that would otherwise contaminate food supplies. Salt curing was another essential technique. They learned exact ratios of salt to meat weight that would preserve protein for weeks or months. Fermentation was used to preserve vegetables when available, and they learned storage techniques that protected food from animals, hanging supplies in trees high enough that bears couldn't reach, storing in metal containers when possible, or creating underground caches that were insulated and protected from both animals and weather extremes. The 27th rule was about emergency medical procedures that could be performed without modern medical equipment. In the Old West, knowing basic trauma care was literally the difference between life and death. Survivors learned how to set broken bones using improvised splints made from branches and cloth. They knew how to stop severe bleeding using pressure points and improvised tourniquets, although they also understood that tourniquets were last resort because they could result in limb loss. They learned basic surgical techniques for removing bullets or arrow points, understanding that sometimes leaving foreign objects in place was safer than attempting removal without proper tools. And perhaps most importantly, they understood signs of shock and knew that keeping trauma victims warm, calm, and hydrated was often more important than any specific medical intervention. The 28th rule was about weather prediction using natural indicators, because in the Wild West, being caught unprepared by weather changes was frequently fatal. The survivors developed a sophisticated understanding of natural weather, signs that were more reliable than any primitive forecasting methods available at the time. They learned that certain cloud formations indicated specific weather patterns. Mackerel skies warned of wind changes. Mammatus clouds signaled severe storms approaching. Animal behavior provided crucial information. Cattle gathering tightly together indicated rain within 24 hours. Birds flying lower than normal suggested pressure changes that preceded storms. Even plant behavior offered clues. Leaves of certain trees would curl or change position before weather changes. Most importantly, They learned that multiple indicators together provided much more accurate predictions than any single sign. The 29th rule was about psychological warfare against yourself, because in the Wild West, your biggest enemy was often your own mind. Isolation, constant danger, and uncertainty created psychological pressure that broke many people before any external threat could kill them. Survivors developed mental techniques for maintaining sanity and motivation during extreme stress. They practiced controlled breathing exercises that helped manage panic in dangerous situations, created mental games and challenges to keep their minds sharp during long, monotonous travel periods, established routine activities that provided a sense of normalcy even in chaotic circumstances. And perhaps most importantly, they learned how to compartmentalize fear, recognizing danger without allowing it to paralyze decision-making. Some veterans talked to themselves constantly, not from madness, but as a deliberate technique for processing information and maintaining mental clarity. The 30th rule was about resource recycling and waste management, because in the Wild West, everything had potential value and nothing could be wasted without potentially fatal consequences. Survivors learned to see potential uses in everything. Worn-out clothing became bandages, rope, or fire-starting material. Animal bones were carved into tools, needles, or fishing hooks. Even human waste was managed carefully, not just for hygiene, but because improper disposal could contaminate water sources or attract dangerous animals. Metal items were particularly precious. A broken cooking pot could become arrowheads. A damaged gun could provide springs and metal parts for other tools. Glass, when available, could become cutting tools, fire-starting lenses, or signaling mirrors. This mentality of total resource utilization meant that survivors could operate independently for much longer periods than those who wastefully discarded potentially useful materials. These 30 rules weren't simple suggestions or guidelines, they were the difference between life and death in one of the most dangerous periods in American history. Each rule represented accumulated wisdom paid for with blood, sweat, and countless lives lost by those who didn't learn fast enough. What's remarkable is that many of these techniques are still relevant today. Modern survival experts still teach water location methods learned from Native Americans, still use star navigation techniques developed by frontier travelers, and still emphasize the psychological preparation that was crucial for Old West survivors. But perhaps the most important lesson from studying survival in the Wild West is understanding that human adaptability is remarkable. People who had never faced extreme hardship before managed to learn complex survival skills. Through necessity, they developed physical and mental toughness that allowed them to thrive in conditions that would challenge even modern survival specialists with all their advanced equipment. Today, when we face our own challenges, whether physical, mental, or emotional, we can draw inspiration from those frontier survivors. They faced uncertainty with determination, adapted to harsh conditions with creativity, and never gave up hope even when odds seemed impossible. Their legacy reminds us that human beings are capable of extraordinary resilience when survival depends on it. The Wild West may be gone, but the lessons learned by those hardy survivors continue to offer valuable insights into human survival, adaptation, and perseverance. Whether you're facing wilderness survival situations or simply navigating daily challenges in modern life, these time-tested principles of preparedness, adaptability, and mental toughness remain as relevant today as they were 150 years ago on the American frontier. And it is this human capacity for adaptation and survival that continues to fascinate historians and survival enthusiasts today, proving that some knowledge is truly timeless, transcending technological advances and changing circumstances to remain eternally valuable.